The bank that invented modern finance. Then collapsed. Florence, 1397. A man named Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici opens a small money-changing operation in a rented room. No marble columns. No carved stone facade. A wooden table, a set of scales, and a ledger. 100 years later, that operation had become the most powerful financial institution in the Western world. It had financed popes, kings, and wars. It had invented tools that every bank on earth still uses today. And it had collapsed so completely that the family who built it fled the city they had dominated for a century, leaving behind empty vaults and furious creditors. This is not a story about greed. Every institution that has ever collapsed had people inside it who understood exactly what was happening and chose not to stop it. This is a story about a specific mechanism. The mechanism that turns the most trusted institution in a system into the most dangerous one. And why, once it starts, it is almost impossible to reverse before the damage is complete. Let's open the autopsy. Giovanni di Bicci understood one thing that his competitors did not. Medieval banking in Europe was fragmented, local, and slow. A merchant in Florence who needed to pay a supplier in Bruges had two options. He could carry gold across 500 miles of dangerous roads, losing some to bandits and some to the road itself. Or he could find someone who could move the value without moving the metal. Giovanni built the infrastructure for the second option. The Medici Bank's core innovation was the letter of credit. A document that allowed a merchant to deposit gold in Florence and collect equivalent value in London, Bruges, or Venice through a network of Medici branch offices and correspondent banks. No physical gold traveling across Europe. Just trust, encoded in paper, validated by the Medici name. This was not a minor convenience. It was the operating system for continental trade. Without it, the volume of commerce that defined the 15th century's economic expansion would have been impossible. The Medici didn't just profit from trade. They enabled trade at a scale that had never existed before. By the time Cosimo de' Medici, Giovanni's son, took control in 1434, the bank had branches in Rome, Venice, Geneva, Bruges, and London. Each branch operated semi-independently under a local manager who held a partial ownership stake. Cosimo had understood something else critical. Central control of a geographically dispersed operation was fragile. Local managers with skin in the game made better decisions than distant employees following orders. The Rome branch was the most profitable. And here is where the first warning appeared in the ledger, visible in hindsight and ignored in practice. The Rome branch's primary client was the papacy. The Catholic Church in the 15th century was not just a religious institution. It was the largest financial operation in Europe. It collected taxes across an entire continent, managed the revenues of hundreds of dioceses, and needed to move enormous sums across borders constantly. The Medici provided that service. In exchange, they received deposits, preferential access, and a near monopoly on papal banking that made the Rome branch extraordinarily lucrative. Concentration. One branch. One client. Generating a disproportionate share of total bank profits. The logic of the relationship was sound. The Pope wasn't going anywhere. The Church wasn't going to collapse. The income was stable, recurring, and enormous. Why wouldn't you build your most important branch around your most important client? Because institutions that seemed permanent had collapsed before. And because the relationship between the Medici and the papacy was not simply a banking arrangement. It was a political entanglement that meant the bank's fortunes were tied not just to the Church's financial needs but to the political survival of whichever pope happened to be in power and the political positioning of the Medici family itself. When those two things moved apart, the bank would feel it. Cosimo managed this tension successfully for 30 years because he understood it. His successors did not, or chose not to. Lorenzo de' Medici, Cosimo's grandson, took control in 1469. History calls him Lorenzo the Magnificent. The name is accurate for what he was. It is not accurate for what he was as a banker. Lorenzo was a politician, a patron, a poet, a diplomat of exceptional skill. He was not interested in the daily management of a bank. He delegated. And what he delegated to, branch by branch, was a generation of managers who had learned to prioritize the relationships that kept politically important clients happy over the financial discipline that kept the bank solvent. The Bruges branch is the documented case. Its manager was Tommaso Portinari, a man whose ambitions ran ahead of his judgment. Portinari wanted to be a great figure in the Burgundian court. He extended enormous loans to Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, financing the Duke's military campaigns in exchange for commercial privileges and the social proximity that Portinari craved. The loans were not recovered. Charles the Bold died in battle in 1477. His territories fragmented. The debts dissolved with the political entity that had issued them. The Bruges branch collapsed under the weight of what it was owed and would never receive. Lorenzo was informed. He did not close the branch immediately. He did not replace Portinari immediately. The political relationships were too complex to unwind quickly, or so it seemed at the time. This is the pattern that repeats. Not sudden fraud. Not a single catastrophic decision. A series of individually justifiable accommodations to political reality, each one reasonable in isolation, collectively fatal. The branch managers were not stealing. They were serving clients who mattered. They were extending credit to people who seemed reliable. They were doing what large institutions always do when political relationships and financial discipline come into conflict. They were choosing the relationship. The London branch followed the same trajectory. Edward IV of England owed the Medici enormous sums from loans that financed his wars. When the political winds shifted and repayment became inconvenient for the English crown, the loans were simply not repaid. The London branch, like the Bruges branch before it, had lent its way into insolvency chasing political proximity. Branch by branch, the same mechanism. Extend credit to powerful clients. Political clients do not repay on normal commercial terms. The branch absorbs the loss. The center knows but does not act decisively because acting decisively means confronting clients who are also political patrons. And then came 1478. The Pizzi conspiracy. The Pizzi family, rival Florentine bankers, attempted to assassinate Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano during High Mass at the Florence Cathedral. Giuliano was killed. Lorenzo escaped wounded. The conspiracy had the tacit support of Pope Sixtus IV, who had grown increasingly hostile to Medici political dominance. The aftermath was not just political. It was financial. Pope Sixtus withdrew papal accounts from the Medici Bank and transferred them to the Pizzi's banking connections. The Rome branch, the single most profitable operation in the entire network, lost its primary client overnight. Not through financial failure. Through political conflict that had nothing to do with the quality of Medici banking services. The concentration that had built the empire now destroyed it. The Rome branch had been the profit engine that masked the losses accumulating in Bruges, London, and Lyon. When the papal relationship ended, there was no longer enough profitable business to offset what the failing branches were losing. The entire structure, which had looked solid from the outside for decades, revealed itself as something that had been hollow at the center for years. Lorenzo spent the next decade in financial retreat. Branches closed. Staff were let go. The bank that had operated across a continent contracted back toward Florence. He borrowed from the public funds he administered as a government official to cover shortfalls, a decision that later investigators would characterize in terms that did not flatter his memory. Lorenzo died in 1492. His son Piero inherited the bank and the political situation simultaneously, and managed both badly. In 1494, the French King Charles VIII invaded Italy. Piero de' Medici, in an act of political capitulation that Florence never forgave, surrendered key Florentine fortresses to the French without a fight. The city revolted. The Medici were expelled. Crowds sacked the Medici palace. The bank's remaining assets in Florence were seized or scattered. The institution that Giovanni di Bicci had built from a rented room in 1397 was gone 97 years later. Not because banking itself had failed. Because the specific vulnerabilities that had been accumulating inside the institution for 2 decades had finally met a crisis large enough to expose them all at once. Here is the forensic breakdown. 3 things destroyed the Medici Bank. Not 1. 3, working together across decades. The first was client concentration in politically unstable relationships. The Rome branch's dependence on papal banking, the Bruges branch's exposure to Burgundian court finance, the London branch's loans to the English crown. Each of these relationships was individually logical. Each made the bank's fortunes hostage to political decisions made by people whose primary loyalty was never to the bank's solvency. The second was the corruption of the branch management structure. Giovanni di Bicci's original design had been correct. Semi-independent branches with local managers holding ownership stakes, making decisions with their own money at risk. That structure deteriorated under Lorenzo. Managers became political operators first and bankers second. Portinari in Bruges is the documented extreme, but the pattern was present across multiple branches. When the people running the institution prioritize the relationships that advance their personal position over the financial rules that protect the institution begins dying before anyone outside it notices. The third was the absence of anyone willing to deliver bad news and be heard. Lorenzo knew the Bruges situation was bad. He knew the London loans were unlikely to be fully repaid. He knew the Rome branch's papal relationship was under political strain years before Sixtus withdrew the accounts. None of this knowledge translated into decisive corrective action because decisive action would have disrupted relationships that seemed more important in the short term than the financial survival of the institution in the long term. These 3 mechanisms are not unique to the Medici Bank. They are present in every major institutional financial collapse since. The specifics change. The underlying structure does not. The Medici Bank's collapse did not destroy Florence overnight. The city recovered. Banking continued. Other institutions rose to fill the space the Medici had occupied. But the individuals who had trusted the bank's promises, the depositors, the correspondent banks, the suppliers of the great commercial network the Medici had built, experienced exactly what depositors and creditors always experience when the most trusted institution in a system fails. The promises did not survive the institution that had made them. The letter of credit that Giovanni di Bicci had made the foundation of continental trade was only worth what the institution behind it was worth. When the institution failed, the paper failed with it. Not because the underlying need for credit had disappeared. Because trust, once broken at scale, does not rebuild quickly. The commerce that had flowed through Medici infrastructure found other channels slowly, painfully, and at significant cost to everyone who had organized their affairs around the assumption that the most established name in European finance was also the most permanent. Here is what the Medici autopsy says to anyone watching this channel. The most dangerous financial institution in any system is not the weakest one. It is the most trusted one. Because the most trusted institution is the one that has accumulated the largest concentration of dependent relationships, the one whose failure causes the most collateral damage, and the one that receives the most political protection against early corrective action precisely because it is too important to be allowed to fail visibly until it is too late to fail quietly. Giovanni di Bicci built something genuine. The tools he invented, the letter of credit, the correspondent banking network, the branch structure with local accountability, these were real innovations that made real commerce possible. They still underlie the banking system you use today. That is not nothing. It is, in fact, everything. But the institution he built was also subject to the same pressures that every institution faces when it becomes important enough to attract political relationships. And those pressures, across 97 years and 4 generations of management, did exactly what they always do. They converted a financial institution into a political one. And political institutions make financial decisions for non-financial reasons. And non-financial reasons do not keep ledgers solvent. The Medici Bank invented modern finance. Then it proved the first of many times that the institutions which invent a system are not immune to the system's failure modes. If anything, they demonstrate those failure modes most clearly. Because they are large enough, old enough, and trusted enough that when they go, everyone can see exactly which mechanisms were responsible. The ledger was always honest. The people reading it chose not to be. That is the autopsy. That is the pattern. And it has not changed in 600 years. If this forensic breakdown gave you a new lens, subscribe to Independent Financial Historian. This channel runs the documented record, not the legend. Drop a hammer and anvil in the comments if you're already building the protocol. Tell me what you want me to dig into next. I read every single one. And remember what the Medici ledgers show clearly. The institution that seems too established to fail is always the one that has had the longest time to build the vulnerabilities nobody wanted to look at directly. The question is only whether you're holding its paper when those vulnerabilities finally surface.